We begin with breaking news from Rafah. The Israeli military has ordered all residents and displaced people to leave the eastern neighborhoods of Gaza's southernmost city. It says they must move to the al-Mawasi area near the coastline. That's ahead of what it says will be the use of extreme force in the eastern part of the city. More than 1.5 million Palestinians have been sheltering in Rafah after the Israeli military forced them out of northern and central Gaza. We are joined now by our correspondent, Hani Mahmoud. He's live for us in Rafah. Firstly, Hani, tell us about this evacuation order and how it's been conveyed to people there.
Yes, well, as of this hour, we're seeing scores of people. People are counted by the tens right now. Entire families have been sheltering inside residential homes in the eastern part of Rafah city. That includes the Salam neighborhood, the Junaina district, and the surrounding areas of these two neighborhoods have started moving out of the area, taking their stuff and their belongings and moving toward the western part of the city. When asked where they are going, they're still not sure where to head. There's a lot of uncertainty going on. The Israeli military, after a terrible night, a quite restless, sleepless, almost 11 air raids across the eastern part, the central of Rafah city, killing at least 20 people, mostly women and children right now. Those people who were inside their residential homes, they were bombed. The difficulties right now faced by and the challenges faced by the civil defense crew on the ground up till the hour. It's been more than 8 hours right now. They're still working on getting people from under the rubbles in the areas that were bombed and overnight attacks across the city. The Israeli military, as early hours this morning, it dropped leaflet and made phone calls sharply ordering people to evacuate the eastern part of Rafah city and to start heading toward the evacuation zones in western part of the city and al-Mawasi, as well as to the western part and the central part of Khan Yunis. That's the evacuation zone that's been designated by the Israeli military, as well as Deir al-Balah. Now, al-Mawasi evacuation zone, or evacuation zone in general, designated by Israeli military, stretch from Deir al-Balah city at the western part, passing it through Khan Yunis all the way to Rafah city, the western part of the city, all the way to the Egyptian Gaza border. Now, this particular evacuation zone or sliver of land at the western part of the strip from the central area, Khan Yunis and Rafah, hasn't been absolutely safe. There were attacks. It was repeatedly attacked by either the artillery shelling as well as by the airstrikes at the time when Khan Yunis was invaded by the Israeli military. People were killed inside the tents that they set up and in the areas they were told to evacuate to. Right now, there's a state of chaos going on. There's a state of panic. People did not expect it to happen rapidly this way.
Chaos and panic, you're saying, Hani, just so soon after people in Rafah were really hopeful that there could be a ceasefire before those negotiations ended. And not only, as you've mentioned, we've seen the Israelis repeatedly attack Mawasi since they designated this area a safe zone. We know the condition that Khan Yunis, one of Gaza's largest cities, was left in after the Israeli forces withdrew from there. So the options now, while the Israelis are telling people to evacuate, really, I mean, the options for them for where to go that's safe, it doesn't sound like there are any.
Absolutely. I mean, it has been proven largely for the past 7 months. Right now, there is no single safe place across Rafah city. And just to give you an example of how these evacuation orders have been largely, as people describe it, with the frustration, contradictory, vague, and misleading for the most part. We have documented cases of people arriving to evacuation zones and within hours, within days of their arrival, they were bombed and killed inside the very areas they were told to evacuate to in order to avoid being bombed in the northern part of Gaza city and more recently in the city of Khan Yunis. Now, that has created a sense of mistrust in the narrative about evacuation zone and led people into a conclusion that you can't create a safe zone in a war zone. And pretty much we look at an entire Gaza Strip being equally bombed, with more of it within the past few weeks concentrated in Rafah city and the central area. Now, the central area, we've seen attacks, constant attack, repeat attacks on refugee camps, the central part of the central area, which makes it less safe right now for people. People are heading toward these areas, but they're walking with this shattered sense of safety, and the feeling that they have, they're going to die here, they're going to die in the evacuation zone. Everywhere is risky, everywhere there is no safety whatsoever.
Hani, thank you very much for that. For now, that is our correspondent, Hani Mahmoud, live in Gaza with the latest on the situation there after the Israeli military has ordered people in Rafah to evacuate. Samah Hadid, the spokesperson for Norwegian Refugee Council, and she's joining us live from Amman. Thank you very much for your time. Firstly, just how problematic is it for Israel to tell people to evacuate to an area that it's attacked a number of times?
It's completely problematic, it's inhumane and unsafe because the al-Mawasi area where people are being ordered to evacuate to is not equipped to accommodate and host more IDPs. The area itself already hosts hundreds of thousands of Palestinian IDPs. It does not have enough humanitarian assistance and services to support additional displaced populations. And also, if Israel is going to order people to move towards the Khan Yunis area, well, that's completely been destroyed throughout the Israeli bombardment over the past period. So these areas that are being ordered for evacuation are not safe. They cannot accommodate further displaced people. And people right now feel as though they have nowhere to go to seek safety. This evacuation order right now is the start of a nightmare scenario for people in Rafah who have been terrified for months now over what is to come. And as aid agencies, we're also terrified about the coming period, because if a Rafah offensive takes place in full force, that would lead to the collapse of the aid response that is really reliant on the Rafah hub to distribute aid, to organize aid throughout that area.
Yeah, you say a nightmare situation for people in Rafah who will tell you that the last 7 months they have been living through a nightmare already. You say that there are already hundreds of thousands of people in Mawasi refugee camp. Can you tell us about the conditions that they're facing? And from what we know about the conditions there, can it take thousands, if not hundreds of thousands more people?
The conditions are woefully inadequate. There are not enough humanitarian assistance and services being given to the population there. It does not have the basic infrastructure in place to service and support the current displaced population there, let alone an additional group of people moving towards there. And these evacuation orders have come really rapidly as well, so they're not giving enough time to the humanitarian sector and aid agencies to support and ramp up aid. Aid at the moment that's coming through into Gaza is inadequate, it's insufficient to support the current population that are displaced. It cannot support another wave of displacement. We are talking about over 1 million people in Rafah who now have to face further displacement, but also death, because we've been warning that a military offensive in Rafah would cause mass atrocities. It would cause mass civilian deaths. And we've been urging the international community and allies of the Israeli government to put a stop to this. Right now, we need every ally of the Israeli government, including the US government, to increase its pressure, stop the arms sales, put pressure on Israel to put a stop to this offensive, which would lead to mass atrocities.
And organizations such as yourself had been urging Israel since the start of the war on Gaza to open the Karam Abu Salim crossing, and with the onset of famine in northern Gaza, many aid organizations had said it is completely unavoidable. Famine in all of Gaza is unavoidable unless Karam Abu Salim is fully functioning again. Israel has closed Karam Abu Salim not long after opening it because of the attack on Israeli soldiers in which something like 3 Israeli soldiers were killed. What impact is that going to have now on the humanitarian situation in Gaza?
Well, closing any further crossings right now would just lead to catastrophic humanitarian conditions. People are already suffering from the significantly inadequate aid that's coming through into Gaza. And a Rafah offensive on top of this would actually lead to the closure of the Rafah crossing, which is really, really necessary right now to get in the supplies to support the displaced population in southern Gaza, but also across Gaza as well. So we need all crossings to be opened urgently. We need humanitarian aid, commercial supplies and goods to enter Gaza as well because of the famine that's underway in northern Gaza. But our fear is now that famine could spread to southern Gaza with this military offensive because of the cut to aid that we'll see over the coming period. This is why we are pleading and urging with the international community to put an end to this military offensive. Otherwise, Gaza will face its deadliest chapter moving forward, where people will die not only from the bombardment, but from inadequate aid, from dehydration and starvation.
Which is, of course, something that we are already seeing very much happening over the last few months. That is the Norwegian Refugee Council's Samah Hadid joining us live from Amman. Thank you very much for your time on this today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, let's stay with this. We are now joined by the UNRWA spokesperson, that is, of course, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, Jonathan Fowler. He's live in occupied East Jerusalem. Thank you for your time. Firstly, your reaction to this Israeli evacuation order telling people in the east of Rafah to leave.
Well, as the previous speaker from the Norwegian Refugee Council put it, I mean, we're in a situation where any large-scale offensive from Israeli forces in Rafah is simply going to mean more suffering and death. The consequences would be devastating. The population in Rafah is 1.4 million. That's about 6 times the pre-war population. Half of that is children. And most of these people have been displaced many times already. So we're simply not in a situation where it's possible for people to continue in these repeat waves of displacement, evacuation. The challenges are just insurmountable at this stage.
And there are just so many problems and challenges out there. I mean, we've spoken with our correspondent and with the Norwegian Refugee Council about just how incredibly problematic it is to ask people to move to al-Mawasi, given the lack of facilities, given it's already so overcrowded, given it's been attacked multiple times. But if you look at the areas of Khan Yunis that people are now looking at going to try and escape this Israeli offensive, we know that after the Israeli forces withdrew from Khan Yunis after weeks of fighting, not only the state that Khan Yunis is in, but the United Nations has said that there's many unexploded ordinances in Khan Yunis, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, for anybody to return to an area, I mean, this is the same in any war zone around the world. In the wake of fighting in any area, you simply cannot have people returning to zones of combat. Precisely for that reason, unexploded ordnance has to be cleared before people are able to return and live in safety. Otherwise, all that's happening is you're pushing people back into a zone where their lives are at risk from the remnants of the previous fighting in that area.
So again, how is this being allowed to happen, Mr. Fowler? How is Israel being allowed to order people to evacuate to places it's attacked, to evacuate to people where there are unexploded ordnance? We were hearing from the Norwegian Refugee Council. They were saying how they're pleading with all countries, including the United States, who have leverage with Israel, not to do this. I wonder what's your experience of speaking to these countries, of speaking to Israel about their plans?
Well, we constantly advocate with all parties to this conflict and indeed across the international community for a ceasefire, and that has to be the bottom line. I mean, whether the question of why things are allowed to happen is another issue. But the thing is, these things have to stop. Nowhere is safe in the Gaza Strip. People have been constantly displaced over and over. Even contingency plans offer little solace. I mean, the grim reality is that when you're moving people around, when people have to flee, there's no way that people can be adequately prepared for the potential consequences. So the fallout from such an offensive would be simply catastrophic, and it cannot happen.
Mr. Fowler, thank you so much for your time on this. That is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency spokesperson, Jonathan Fowler, live in occupied East Jerusalem.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get latest news from Al Jazeera.